Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. Joining me on the program today, returning, in fact, to Current Affairs, is Émile Torres, the author of the forthcoming Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation, coming in July from Routledge. Émile is an expert on a number of things. Émile is a philosopher and historian who has been writing recently, including for Current Affairs, about a philosophy known as Longtermism, as well as about effective altruism, which is related and which I have written about myself for Current Affairs. Émile Torres, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
So here's my worry with any conversation that you and I might have on these topics, is that you and I agree, for the most part, about effective altruism and long-termism, and we also, having both written a lot about these things, might end up speaking in ways that assume a familiarity or diving into the conversation that you and I would have, rather than for listeners and readers who are totally unfamiliar with these things and don't know why they should care. So we need to begin at the place where listeners and readers who don't know why they should care begin. And I thought one question I could ask you to begin with was, let's say that I am where I was in 2013 when I met my first effective altruist, and they tried to tell me what this was all about and why I should believe it. Could you give me the pitch that effective altruism would give me in order to try to get me to become an effective altruist? In other words, let's be fair to the ideology before we discuss why it's so toxic and terrible.
Yeah, sure. I think one way to approach understanding effective altruism is to sort of decompose it into its two main components. So you've got the effective aspect and then the altruism aspect. And one thing that the effective altruists, or EAs, as they're known, would point to is this paper written by a utilitarian philosopher named Peter Singer. And it was published in the early 70s. I think it was 1972. I might be wrong about the exact date. And he basically made the argument that, if you're walking, home one day from work and you recently bought new shoes and, really nice new suit, but then you see, maybe 20, 30 feet away from you in a relatively shallow pond, a small child who is drowning. Most of us wouldn't think twice about, running into that lake to save the drowning child, thereby ruining our shoes and our suit. And so he basically made the case that if most of us would just reflexively run in to save that child, what difference does it make that, this helpless kid is, 20, 30 feet away from us? Because right now, all around the world, there are people suffering tremendously, people dying. The statistics I saw most recently is something around 15,000 children die every single day of hunger-related illnesses. And so the argument was that rather than buy new shoes or a new suit in the first place, what those of us, who reside in affluent nations in the global north, what we should do is forbear buying those things in the first place and take, a portion, maybe even a significant amount of our disposable income and donate it to charities that are going to help save the lives of children, so to speak, drowning in other parts of the world. So the proximity of suffering really shouldn't matter. And I mean, he's sort of gesturing at this idea of altruism, trying to make a case that, we should be altruistic.
Right. And not just that we should be altruistic, but if you, from the premise that you would save a drowning child in front of you, okay, take your normal moral instincts seriously, be consistent with them, and when we work them out, when we extrapolate them, we see that we have all of these other obligations that are no less pressing than our obligation would be to pull a child out of a lake if we saw them in front of us drowning.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's inconsistent to sacrifice something in order to save the child, but then not to donate, a significant portion of our disposable income to help people all around the world. So, yeah, this is the idea of altruism in order to help, other human beings in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a further question, which is
Effective.
convinced. Yeah, the effective part. If one's convinced, okay, I should be an altruist, there's a second question, which is which charities should I donate to?
Mm-hmm.
Should I give to disaster relief? Should I instead buy, anti-malarial bed nets to protect people from malaria in certain regions of the world? And so this is where you get this idea of effective altruism being developed. And so this was, around the 2000s, kind of late 2000s, a number of philosophers at Oxford who were trying to investigate this question. So they crunched the numbers and came to some conclusions that are oftentimes a bit counterintuitive. Like actually disaster relief is really not one of the best ways to get, a bang for your buck. You should instead buy anti-malarial bed nets or donate to deworming initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of altruism sort of goes back to the 1970s, but it wasn't until the 2000s that people started to think sort of quantitatively and try to crunch the numbers and answer in a robust way based on science and reason which charities one should give to maximize the positive impact they have in the world.
Yeah, so you said a couple times there, crunch the numbers, which seems to be a major part of the actual effective altruist movement. It's not just, we have this expanded circle of moral obligations to our fellow creatures, but also a kind of utilitarianism is very much part of the effective altruist philosophy, which Peter Singer is a famous utilitarian, and the essential utilitarian principle is you should maximize pleasure, minimize pain, or maximize the good and minimize the negative. In fact, I think Peter Singer's book is called The Most Good You Can Do. And so it leads people who follow this philosophy to say, okay, well, then we need to quantitatively compare how morally good various courses of action are. And some of what they do in that respect seems to lead to conclusions that are pretty helpful. Like, for example, well, is philanthropy towards, say, donating to the Princeton Alumni Fund, is that equally morally good to try to save people from malaria? Because a lot of times, that's an obvious extreme contrast, but they pointed out that a lot of charities don't really measure the impact of what they do. And when you start to look at the impact of charities rather than how good it feels to donate to them or how glossy their brochure is, then you can actually make sure that the consequences of your actions in the world are as positive as they could be.
That's exactly right. One doesn't need to subscribe to the utilitarian ethical theory in order to be an effective altruist. But there's no question that EA has been heavily influenced by utilitarianism. And utilitarianism offers a very quantitative approach to ethics. Somewhere around the core of EA, there is a bias towards the quantitative. And, I would agree that the question of what exactly is the impact of the efforts made by, certain charities, this is a good thing to investigate and to try to better understand. There are criticisms that one could make about this particular approach. For example, some of the metrics that have been used in the past, quality adjusted life years, things of that nature are sort of problematic in different ways. But I think, at first glance, there is something sort of appealing about the EA approach. Yeah, and the spirit behind it is something that one might even applaud.
Yeah, well, it encourages us to be better people. And so for people who do have the instinct that they would like their life to be meaningful and that they would like to derive meaning from helping other people, it says, okay, well, how do you help others? We're going to help you help others. And I admire that, and it means that at first glance, effective altruism sounds almost unobjectionable. How could you object to altruism? How could you object to making altruism more effective? I mean, these are so obvious. But one of the places at which I think your and my critique starts is that the pitch tries to make it sound as if effective altruism is obvious. So, in fact, so much so that it would be hard to even mount any kind of argument against it. But when you look under the surface and when you look at the actual existing effective altruist movement, you quickly begin to find that it takes us to some bizarre places intellectually that are non-obvious to people, and in fact would make people quite uncomfortable in how they conflict with people's moral instincts. And my first hint about this was when I saw someone making an argument at a party. They were coming from an effective altruist perspective, and they were arguing to someone who was in law school, and she was going to go work, I think, at the public defender or legal aid. Mm-hmm. And the effective altruist was telling her, well, that's immoral. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. Because the way to measure your actions, your impact, is what would happen if you didn't go to work at legal aid. If you didn't go to legal aid, work at legal aid, someone else would. Therefore, you're not making any difference. Therefore, what you think is good is actually not good at all. Mm-hmm. In fact, what you should do if you want to be good is you should go to work at a Wall Street law firm, get a big salary, and donate that money to a malaria charity. And in fact, if you don't do that, if you choose to go to work at legal aid, you are technically a worse person. And the person who this argument was being made to got very upset, and the conversation didn't end well. Mm-hmm. But that was where I started to think, there's something very odd about this effective altruism thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so this is the idea of earn to give. And part of the argument involves this counterfactual. You know, if the aim is to save as many lives as possible, that might mean, if you crunch the numbers, might mean buying the greatest number of bed nets. How do you buy the greatest number of bed nets? Well, one way is to get the most lucrative job you could possibly get. So that means, going to work on Wall Street, for example. There are a bunch of EAs, such as Matthew Wage, as well as somebody who your audience might be familiar with, Sam Bankman-Fried, also went to work for a particular company called Jane Street Capital. And, so these are high-paying jobs. They have a greater income. Then they can take that income and spend it on deworming initiatives or buying anti-malarial bed nets. And so the counterfactual comes in to the argument in the following way. Sure, some of these companies may be objectionable. They may even be what, McCaskill used this term in one of the papers he wrote defending this idea.
Wait, you said McCaskill. I don't think we've introduced McCaskill sufficiently.
Yes, so sorry. Yeah, William McCaskill. So he's one of the originators of the effective altruist kind of philosophy, along with Toby Ord. Both of them were at Oxford. And McCaskill has become fairly well known. He's sort of the poster boy of EA for the longest time, and more recently has gotten a lot of press for his advocacy of long-termism.
Which we will also discuss.
Which we will discuss momentarily. Sort of an offshoot, one of the main cause areas, as it were, of effective altruism. So Will McCaskill used this term of evil organizations, which may be an appropriate descriptor for Jane Street Capital. He even mentioned, some petrochemical companies and so on. So, these are evil organizations. We can agree on that. Does that mean you shouldn't go work for them? His argument was no, and it was a counterfactual argument that if you don't work for these companies, somebody else is going to, get the job. Chances are those individuals are not going to siphon off a significant portion of their income for altruistic reasons to help other people around the world. And consequently, all things considered, it would be better for you to just go ahead and take that job, work for a petrochemical company, go work for Jane Street Capital, maybe even go into crypto. And ultimately then, the total amount of good that will result from that is greater, perhaps much greater, than if you went to work for a nonprofit and let somebody else take that job at the petrochemical company or Jane Street Capital. So yeah, that's the counterfactual argument for earn to give.
Mm-hmm. See, we have begun in the place where we say, well, don't you care about other people and don't you want to be effective? And then very quickly we have followed the logic down to, well, actually, people who work at petrochemical companies can be morally better than teachers and social workers because if they donate more of their income to do more good in the world, there's two parts of it, right? There's the earning to give, which is, well, you're taking your salary at the evil organization and using it to do good, but you're not doing any good within the evil organization. And then there's the question, well, within the evil organization, are you able to mitigate the evil through your presence versus the presence of someone less evil, which we might call the is it a moral obligation to be a concentration camp guard argument, which in fact McCaskill discussed, because he said, yeah, as I was researching my article on effective altruism, I read, he said, you may be thinking when I make this argument, well, wouldn't that mean that in Nazi Germany, the job of a good person would be to become a concentration camp guard so that fewer sadists and sociopaths became concentration camp guards? Because if you refuse and everyone who's not a sadist or sociopath refuses, then only the sadists and sociopaths will be the concentration camp guards. And I thought he wriggled out of this in a very unsatisfactory way, which was to say, well, there are some things so immoral that nobody should do them, which being a concentration camp guard is, but working at a petrochemical company isn't.
Yeah, one of the criticisms of this particular argument that he propounded is precisely what you're gesturing at, that he distinguishes, I forget the exact term he uses, but just like deeply objectionable careers or jobs versus the acceptably objectionable careers at evil organizations like petrochemical companies. And the distinction between the two just isn't really well motivated. So it does seem like if you, at least to my eye, if you accept that based on this counterfactual consideration, you should go work for a petrochemical company, that also does seem to support the conclusion that you should go work at a concentration camp. Because again, like you said, I mean, maybe you're an altruist, not a sociopath or a sadist. If you don't take that job, a sociopath or sadist will. So, yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of very strange, counterintuitive conclusions that many of the leading EAs have defended. I mean, they've also argued quite vigorously that we should actively support sweatshop labor in the global south, because, it turns out that actually the jobs in sweatshops are better than the alternative jobs that people have. Mm-hmm. And so by supporting the sweatshops, you're supporting the best jobs, relatively speaking, that exist in these areas.
Yes. And in fact, by protesting sweatshops, the opponents of sweatshop labor are worse people than the people who are building the sweatshops, who are actually the altruists.
So, pretty quickly you end up with, a number of views that I think many people find somewhat repugnant. But these are conclusions that I think there are good arguments that they follow from the EA premises.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this, it's really about, working within systems. There's almost no serious thought within EA, at least not that I've seen, about the origins of a lot of problems around the world. Those origins being in systems of power, structures that have enabled individuals in the global south to end up being very destitute, end up being, there's no discussion of the legacies of colonialism and so on. It's about working within these systems.
No, there certainly is. I'm laughing because it's inconceivable to me that the effective altruist talking about colonialism is like, the philosophy is so far from that.
Yeah. I mean, it's really pretty shocking and pretty appalling the extent to which these other considerations about, colonialism, about capitalism, for example, are just not really even on the radar of a lot of EAs.
Yeah, well, we mentioned the person and the drowning pond, and I think when we start to think about where they start from and how the reasoning works, one of the things that we notice upon closer examination is that it very much takes us at the perspective of being an individual who has to decide how to make the most good as an individual, rather than as part of a collective movement where your individual contribution is not, in fact, measurable. And participating in a political movement, you can't measure your individual impact. And there is very little discussion in the EA literature, although I've read people denying this. I don't think those denials are credible, but there's very little discussion in the EA literature of the role of political movements in creating social change. The whole perspective is, well, how much money could you donate? Which assumes that you are a person who's basically in a Western country and able to earn a lot of money. But very little discussion of, for example, well, how do we put a tax on rich people? Even though if you want to maximize the amount of good you do, it's much easier to just have the state take the money from all of the people who work on Wall Street than from you, one person, to go to work on Wall Street and just donate your income while everyone else doesn't.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's pretty astonishing the extent to which these other possibilities are ignored, or to use a term that they like, neglected, because they want to focus on topics that are neglected as well as important and tractable. Well, I mean, this is an issue that within the EA movement is extraordinarily neglected. And I think that's a real shame. I mean, you made the point in your really excellent critique of EA and long-termism that socialism might be a really good way to, actually maximize the good that occurs in the world.
Right. I mean, I am a socialist because I am a lowercase EA effective altruist, right?
Yeah.
And I think we can distinguish between effective altruism, lowercase, as in just caring about other people and trying to do it well, and this movement that has sprung up that focuses on particular ways to do good. And at this point, people might be wondering, well, is this movement significant? We have talked so far, okay, we've laid out, there are these people who believe this thing, but I think you've made the case before that as small as effective altruism might be, it has built up quite a lot of influence and quite a lot of funding. And so perhaps you could talk about why you think it's worth everyone paying attention to these mistakes rather than just here's a movement that makes mistakes that we don't approve of.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the EA movement, at least before the catastrophic collapse of FTX last November, it had 46.1 billion in committed funding. So just an enormous amount of money that they could spend on their research projects. I mean, a lot of that money actually is funneled right back into the movement for the sake of movement building, as they would put it. So, they, and maybe there's some questionable purchases that they have made in an effort to further, build their community. For example, they spent £15 million on a palatial estate in Oxfordshire, just outside of Oxford. And so anyways, I mean, there's a huge amount of money behind it. And then one of the main cause areas, which we referenced earlier, which is long-termism. I think long-termism in particular has become an ideology that is hugely influential in the tech industry. One could make the case that a fair amount of the research being conducted right now in an attempt to create human-level artificial intelligence or even artificial superintelligence is motivated by this long-termist ideology. There are people in the tech sector who I've spoken to who have affirmed, I mean, it's absolutely ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous in Silicon Valley. Elon Musk refers to long-termism as, quote, a close match to my own philosophy. And there are also, reports over the past, 6 months at least that indicate this long-termist ideology is infiltrating major world governments, the US government, UK government, the United Nations. There was a UN Dispatch article from, I think it was probably August, that explicitly states foreign policy circles and the UN in particular are beginning to embrace the long-termist ideology. So it was last summer that Will MacAskill published his defense, comprehensive defense of long-termism called What We Owe the Future. And that's coincided with this sort of media blitz, New York Times, New Yorker, Guardian, BBC, Foreign Affairs, and so on, all covered MacAskill or EA or long-termism, oftentimes quite favorably. And as a result, the public sort of got their first glimpse of this ideology and what it is. But I mean, over the past few years, before long-termism, there was this big push to increase the public visibility of long-termism. Long-termists have sort of been working behind the scenes to infiltrate the governments, to influence tech billionaires, to appeal to individuals in the tech sector. So, I mean, I would make the case that it is an enormously powerful movement, and the ideology is just, very pervasive.
Yeah.
So it's really important that people understand what the ideology is, why it might be potentially dangerous, as I've argued on many occasions, and that they understand that this is not just some small group of people at the fringe.
Right.
I mean, these are individuals who have tremendous power, and even after the collapse of FTX, which resulted in some of that 46.1 billion disappearing, just evaporating overnight, there still are just billions and billions of dollars that will be dedicated specifically to fund long-termist efforts, long-termist research projects, and so on. So this is not something to ignore. This is very important.
No, there's a there's a reason that you and I have sort of spent so much time meticulously trying to expose the philosophical errors and the dangerous implications of the ideas expounded by this movement. And it is because they threaten to have some success.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you have escalated in your last answer the frequency of your use of the term long-termism. So we're going to have to now explain to the people long-termism, which, if I had to do it succinctly, I'd say, well, let's start by going back to our drowning child. And if the first question that Peter Singer asks you is, why don't you care equally about a child who is far away in space, on the other side of the world, the long-termist follows up Mr. Singer's question by asking you why you don't equally care about the child far away in time. That is, the child born 50, 1,000, 1,000,000 years from now. But how would you introduce it?
Not even just 1,000,000.
To get us started, 1,000,000.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great way to introduce the idea. We shouldn't spatially discount the suffering of somebody far away in space doesn't count for less than the suffering of somebody who's right next to us. In the same sense, then we shouldn't temporally discount the suffering of somebody 1,000,000,000 years from now doesn't count for less. In deciding which actions we ought to take, we should include within our moral deliberations the predicament of people in the very far future, not just in the present. And so basically, the long-termist idea, it has roots that go back really to the 1980s, actually even maybe to the 19th century with a utilitarian philosopher named Henry Sidgwick. But it was really the 1980s with Derek Parfit, who first sort of, there were a few other philosophers right around that time who also kind of addressed this particular issue. But I would say it was the last 20 years, since 2002, 2003, when Oxford philosopher named Nick Bostrom, another name that people might be familiar with, as he's been in the news recently for a rather racist email that was
rather extremely racist. Yeah. And we've discussed Nick Bostrom on this program before in the context of his superintelligence theory. Our conversations with Benjamin Lee and Eric Larson both touched on. So our listeners will be familiar with Bostrom.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so in 2003, he published this article in which he took seriously the potential bigness of our future. So, here on Earth, Homo sapiens has been around for 300,000 years, maybe 200,000 years. Our planet will remain habitable for another roughly billion years, maybe 800 million years. So just an enormously greater amount of time in our future, just on this planet than in our past so far. So in that sense, human history may be just beginning. But of course, over the next 800 million or a billion years, we might begin to colonize space. And if we do that, the future human population could be or could become just really enormous. There could be 10 to the 38 people is one of the numbers that he calculated if we colonize our local cluster, supercluster of galaxies called the Virgo supercluster. And so compare, 10 to the 38 to 8 billion people on Earth right now. One number is just many, many orders of magnitude greater than the other number. In subsequent calculations, he suggested that there could be maybe upwards of 10 to the 58 people within within our future light cone. So the region of space that is theoretically accessible to us. And this calculation in particular relied on the possibility, not just that we go out and create space stations, that could house tens of millions of people, so-called O'Neill cylinders would be one example, or that we inhabit exoplanets out there that are sort of like Earth, that are orbiting their own stars. But also we could gather together material resources in space, build these giant computers, so planet-sized computers,
yes,
and then run these high-resolution simulations in which you could have all of the digital people interacting with each other, living happy lives, and so on. And the idea is that you can fit a lot more people within our future light cone, within the accessible universe, than you can just fit them on exoplanets. So if we build these computers, then we could maximize the future human population even more. So the way that this fits with EA is, during the 2000s, they established this philosophy. The central aim is to do the most good possible.
Yes.
And then some of them encountered Bostrom's work and read this paper and thought, wow, the future could be really, really enormous. And there could be just astronomical numbers of people in the future. So if I want to do the most good I possibly can, well, you could say, since I want to positively influence the greatest number of people possible, and since there are far more people existing in the far future than there are at present, maybe what I should do is pivot away from the contemporary realm and focus instead on the very far future. Maybe there are actions I can take today that will have some kind of non-trivial impact on people in the future. So, you can imagine there are 1.3 billion people in multidimensional poverty today. You can imagine you've got finite resources and you lift all of these individuals out of multidimensional poverty. That does something very good. But if you were to take an action that affected just 1%, or maybe a much smaller percentage than that, of the 10 to the 58 people who exist in the future, in absolute terms, that is a much, much, much greater number of people.
Right.
So therefore, if you are really altruistic, you should not be focusing on current day people. You should be focusing on these far future people.
Okay. So you have told us a story there that I think some people might think sounds a little ridiculous, thinking, billions of years into the future. But I think the point that you ultimately end up on there is critical, which is that if you follow from the utilitarian premise that we have to maximize the good, this can be where you end up. You can end up saying, well, what about the people billions of years in the future? And what you then end up doing correspondingly is saying that the most pressing needs of our moment, the poverty, as you mentioned, climate change, anything that does not outright threaten to cut the species off and make us completely extinct, really doesn't matter very much.
Yeah, I think that is a conclusion that follows pretty straightforwardly from this ideology. And so in practice, there are a number of long-termists who do donate to alleviate global poverty, who do care about, some of these shorter term issues. The worry is that the ideology itself implies that contemporary problems, the suffering of current day people, that matters only insofar as focusing on those things will improve the very far future.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, I mean, the key idea is that the future could be huge. Not just could be huge, but it should be huge. Bigger is better, as McCaskill argues in his book. And that is very consistent with the utilitarian ethical theory that has inspired, in a significant way, has inspired this sort of perspective on our current situation and how we ought to act these days, and why we should be focusing primarily on people in the very far future. So there is a danger, I think, that if people take long-termism seriously, by virtue of the bigness of the future, that will trump contemporary problems in just every circumstance.
Yeah.
Climate change, for example,
Right.
it's probably not going to be an existential risk, as they would say.
There'll be some people left.
But yeah, it's almost certainly not going to result in human extinction. One way it could is if there's a runaway greenhouse effect. But the best science available right now suggests that that's very improbable.
Yeah.
So if you take this cosmic vantage point, if you take this cosmic perspective on the human predicament, climate change sort of shrinks to almost nothing. I mean, if we were to phase out fossil fuels in the 21st century, the effects would last for maybe 10,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
10,000 years is a very long time, and that's many, many generations of future humans who would be suffering the consequences of catastrophic climate change. But in the grand scheme of things,
there we go. Now that it doesn't matter at all.
10,000 years is not that much. I mean,
Yeah.
we could exist into the future,
Sure,
at least another 10
boy.
to the 40 years. So that's a 1 followed by 40 zeros.
Sure.
That absolutely dwarfs,
Yeah.
10,000.
So it becomes an excuse for not caring about contemporary problems, and you could spend all of your time. It becomes a moral justification for just researching how to simulate human consciousness. Because once you can run simulations of human beings on the computer, you can just maximize the number of them that you make, your little fake people. And as long as you're running them, you're dwarfing any of the moral catastrophes that your actions are unleashing. It also sort of gives you cover to do destructive things in the name of not just to not care about contemporary problems, but to make problems worse if they get us towards that glorious, long-term utopian future. In fact, you've cited long-termist arguments that it's actually more moral to care about people in the developing world because they're the people who can then go on and do all the good.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there are two related but distinct issues here. One is the possibility that the long-termist ideology will lead true believers to minimize, trivialize, or ignore contemporary problems, because one ought to be focusing instead on the very far future, millions, billions, trillions of years from now. So that's one issue. The other is the possibility that it might actually justify, again, sort of in scare quotes, in the minds of true believers, extreme, potentially violent actions today for the sake of realizing this, kind of techno-utopian world amongst the stars, with full of astronomical amounts of value. And I think this is a serious objection to make. After all, there are, history is full of movements that became violent, that started wars, that engaged in terrorism, that were motivated by this vision of astronomical or infinite amounts of value in the future.
Mm.
They don't just justify the means, but I mean, the ends are so valuable that there's kind of nothing off the table. I mean, Nick Bostrom himself has argued that preemptive violence might be necessary in order to protect our future. You just mentioned, a quote from a dissertation published in 2013 by Nick Beckstead, who's also kind of one of the founders of the long-termist ideology. And he, I think, draws the correct conclusion from the premises of long-termism, which is that if what matters most is how things go in the very, very far future, then you should prioritize saving the lives of people in rich countries over the lives of people in poor countries. And the reasons that, rich countries, we have more economic productivity, more innovation, and so on. Those are the things that will influence the very far future. Not, trying to help individuals who are struggling to eat 3 times a day to actually get those meals. So this is a quote that I think underlines the potential danger, and it underlines just how radical the long-termist view can be if it's taken seriously.
And a couple of other things that come out of it, or threaten to come out of it, are a contempt for democracy, because obviously, if you have discovered the mathematical, objectively correct way to determine the human ends that should be pursued, doesn't really matter what anyone else has to say about it, because they're objectively wrong. There's a certain arrogance and a certain assumption that the people who have found the answers are entitled to impose them upon anyone else. And correspondingly, there is this sort of belief that elites ought to rule, those who have discovered these morally optimal mathematical truths. And you've even pointed out that there's kind of eugenicist language that flows through this movement, this idea that you want to optimize human beings, right? You want to better the species, and there can be some very, very ugly possibilities that flow out of the internal logic held by those who adhere to this movement.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one component of the long-termist ideology is a particular ethic called transhumanism. And Nick Bostrom, in fact, is one of the most prominent defenders and champions of this transhumanist philosophy. And the idea is that the emerging technologies, so things like genetic engineering, synthetic biology, molecular nanotechnology, and AI, and so on, that these may enable us to radically modify the human organism in various ways. And perhaps some of these ways will result in modes of existence that are better in some very significant way than our current mode. Like maybe we're able to become super intelligent, to think thoughts that are completely out of our epistemic reach, ideas that we just cannot even entertain. Perhaps we can begin to solve some of the mysteries of the universe that right now are just unattainable for us. We could also become immortal. And so transhumanism says, not only will we be able to radically enhance, as they would say, humanity in the future, but we should do this. We should pursue these technologies. Some have called them person engineering technologies, and through a kind of intelligent redesign to modify ourselves to become a new, superior post-human species. And so this connects quite directly with 20th century eugenics. In fact, contemporarily, philosophers would classify transhumanism as a type of liberal eugenics. And, they would argue that the qualifier liberal makes all the difference in the world, morally speaking. I actually would object to that. I think there are good arguments for why transhumanism in practice would ultimately be quite illiberal. But even beyond its classification as a kind of eugenics today, I mean, this idea of transhumanism was developed by the more authoritarian, illiberal eugenicists of the 20th century. J.B.S. Haldane is one example. J.D. Bernal is another, and in particular, Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley was president of the British Eugenics Society from 1959 to 1962, and was really one of the most vocal and vigorous advocates of eugenics throughout the 20th century. And in the second half of the 20th century in particular, he popularized this idea of transhumanism. So there's a direct genealogical link as well. And I mean, maybe another thing to mention just in terms of the connection here, not only does transhumanism and hence long-termism have roots that go directly back to 20th century authoritarian eugenics, but a lot of those eugenicists from the past century were animated and motivated by certain racist, xenophobic, ableist, classist attitudes. And if you wander around the neighborhood of long-termism, and transhumanism as well, it is difficult not to see those same attitudes kind of all over the place.
Well, right.
So that's worrisome as well. I mean, there are a lot of advocates of transhumanism and long-termism who, if you ask them, will explicitly denounce these sorts of attitudes. But, read some of the things they've written,
right,
or listen to some of the things that they've said, and it becomes apparent that actually some of these discriminatory kind of views, are really actually quite ubiquitous.
Yeah. Well, Nick Bostrom was just in trouble for this old racist email, like incredibly racist, like, just announcing a belief in black inferiority and using the N-word and such. But I've seen effective altruists going, well, of what relevance is it? One of the prominent figures said or did or held a racist attitude. And then, of course, the relevance is that you're part of a movement that believes that elites based out of a castle in Oxford should rule the world. That's what the relevance is. And of course, they don't believe that Africans are capable of deciding what's best for Africans. They believe that they have mathematically decided what's best for them. But here's how I want to finish up, because I think it is easy for a normal person that is not a long-termist to listen to our conversation and go, yeah, that sounds crazy and scary, and I don't want those people to have any power. If I was a long-termist or effective altruist, I would listen and go, well, you have shown that if you follow our premises, you get to these places, and you think these places are bad places to end up, right? You think, and I've seen people say this about you, they said, Émile Torres says that long-termism leads to the conclusion that it's morally necessary to create billions of simulated humans on a computer. Yes, and what's wrong with that? That's correct. So what I want to finish up by asking you is, where did they go wrong, right? If you reject the premises, you said that actually they are following their philosophy consistently. So we have to go to the root, and we have to say, at what point is it that you should stop following Peter Singer down to his, well, do you care about the child? Okay, do you care about this child? Okay, do you care about this child? Okay, then you have to care about the billions of potential children that we can make in the future. In fact, I think McCaskill himself said that effective altruists take you on a train to Crazy Town, and everyone's got to get off somewhere. And he gets off before, become a concentration camp guard, but not before become a petrochemical engineer. So how do you stop the train from getting out of the station to begin with, philosophically speaking?
Yeah, a couple things to say. So trying to predict the future in general is really hard. I mean, it's a good laugh to go and read about predictions that were made in, the 1950s about what, 2023 would look like. How can we have even a remotely accurate idea of what the future might be like in, 1,000 or million, billion, trillion, so on years from now? We're just absolutely clueless about what the far future is going to look like. So I think that's sort of one problem. Once you recognize that we are clueless, that I think supports focusing more on issues that we aren't clueless about, such as global poverty, climate change, environmental destruction, and so on. Another issue is the long-termist view of human extinction. You referenced this earlier. As we were saying, I mean, it's very intertwined with a utilitarian kind of ethical framework. And on the utilitarian view, one way to understand it is that there is no intrinsic difference between the non-birth of somebody who would have a happy life and the sudden death of somebody who has a happy life. Because all that matters is the total quantity of value in the universe as a whole. So from this perspective, not only are we morally obliged to try to increase the well-being of individuals who currently exist, but we're also obliged to increase the human population insofar as new people would have net positive amounts of well-being. The more of those people we create, the better the universe will become in general.
Can I just pause and ask you, does that mean that if I don't have kids, every child I don't have is basically a child I'm murdering or snuffing out of existence.
I mean, it's a bit complicated because, okay, maybe if you murder someone, that might involve inflicting suffering on them. It's, maybe if you were to painlessly remove someone.
Yeah.
So what you have to do when I said there's no intrinsic difference is I'm sort of bracketing out all of the other possible consequences, because it may be very bad to remove someone from existence because that would impact their friends and family and so on. Whereas, the non-birth of somebody wouldn't necessarily impact currently existing people in the very same way. But ultimately, on the utilitarian view, we are just these containers of value.
Right.
We matter only instrumentally, only as a means to an end. What is the end? The end is maximizing value or maximizing well-being. Ultimately, we have these containers that exist in the world. They're called people. And we want to fill them with as much well-being as possible. But we also, in order to maximize value, we want to create new containers that have positive amounts of well-being. The more containers we create, the better the universe will become, as I mentioned before. And so this leads to the view that it is really, really, really bad. For example, if we were to go extinct, let's say we go extinct in a thermonuclear conflict. That would be very bad for two reasons. One is 8 billion people would die horrible deaths. The second reason, which is actually a much, much more significant reason, ethically speaking, according to utilitarianism, is that all of these future possible people will never be born.
Mm-hmm.
And the non-birth of these possible people in the far future means that the universe as a whole will contain far less value than it otherwise could have contained. And that would be an absolute moral catastrophe on their view. So part of the long-termist argument about why we should prioritize avoiding human extinction, maybe over things like alleviating global poverty, some of them have literally made this argument, rests on a certain philosophical view that among philosophers is highly contentious and in my view is very implausible. This notion that the non-birth of all these future people, including all these future digital people, would be some kind of like really awful catastrophe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, by virtue of the numbers of these future people, you have a very good long-termist argument for why you should not focus on contemporary issues so much. Instead, you should be focusing on them, including ensuring that they exist in the first place.
Yeah, the idea of maximizing an abstract quantity like value seems insane to me, and maximizing is never a good idea. I don't think you should ever maximize. You should always get the right amount of things, because maximization is like what we call cancer logic. A cancer maximizes itself, right? A cancer is a perfect long-termist. It's like, let me produce as much of myself as possible, uncontrolled, uncontrolled economic growth. That's maximization logic.
Yeah.
Don't maximize, get the right amount. And my perspective on the whole, intergenerational justice, which existed long before long-termism as a concept, is quite reasonable, thinking about, future generations and how we have a responsibility to them. The long-term question seems to me like it's resolved in part by saying we'll deal with that future when we get to it. Mm-hmm. In that right now we have all these incredibly pressing problems, which are going to be a terrible inheritance for the next few generations. If we can make life for those next few generations much better, we can solve all these short-term problems, then in, a few generations from now, then we can start to have some long-termists who are like, okay, well, we've solved all of the short-term problems. Now let's look at some of the really, really long-term ones.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Well, you and I could chat for a very long time because we get along great and you're a real friend of the magazine and we love your writing here at Current Affairs. People can follow Émile Torres at xriskology on Twitter, and your website is also, I can't remember your website. What's your website?
It's xriskology.com.
Oh, okay. xriskology.com. Thank you so much for joining us today on Current Affairs to explain these pernicious, dangerous, terrible ideas.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a real pleasure.
Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.